Today's daf is Chulin daf lamed ches, and we are 11 lines from the bottom of daf lamed zayin amid beis heichi dami mesukenes. Today's daf is being learned as a schus refuah shalema for Chava Miriam Bas Malka Freda and Shlomo ben Chayaleh. So we're in the middle of a sugya. The sugya began at the beginning of yesterday's daf, and it will, be'ezus Hashem, conclude at the end of today's daf. So this is a two-daf sugya regarding hashoichet es hamisukenes. So we know that a nevela, one is not allowed to eat. A treifa, one is not allowed to eat. What about a misukenes? A misukenes is an animal that's at the end of its life. It's alive, hence it's not a nevela. It doesn't have one of the simone treifa, hence it's not a treifa. But at the same time, it's a animal that clearly does not have a long time to live. The Mishnah says that even though you could have thought that maybe it's not okay for one to shech the misukenes and eat it, the halacha is hashoichet es hamisukenes is going to be kosher, stating that the only time it's okay to shech the misukenes and then eat from its meat is if it shows a sign of life during the course of the shechita. Meaning, we're a little bit concerned that maybe at the onset of the shechita, the animal died and it wasn't able to survive the shechita. Again, an animal's not supposed to survive the shechita, but it wasn't able to survive the part of the shechita that it is supposed to survive, so that we could say that it was killed al yidei the shechita of the Rav Simanim. Now, what exactly is the definition of chiyus? So that was a three-way machlokes in the Mishnah. The first shita was Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, which, by the way, there's a big shaila amongst the Rishonim. Is the Girsa Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, or is the Girsa Rabban Gamliel? Rashi and Tosfos are actually Girs, not the way we have it in the Mishnah. They're Girs Rabban Gamliel, not Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. But regardless, the first shita of the Mishnah was that if it jerks its hand and its foot, if it's mefarches, it's yad v'regel, that would be a sign of life. Rabbi Eliezer, we saw in the Mishnah, was also the shita of Reb Shimon, said that if it was zinka dam, if it coughed up blood, that would be a sign that it was alive. And finally, the shita of the Chachamim was it's toli and pirchus, but it doesn't have to be mefarches yad v'regel, or yad or regel. That in itself would be okay. Or if it wagged its tail, that would also be a sign of life. We spoke out Tosfos that says that even though the Lashon HaMishnah had shoichet es hamisukenes sounds like it's only a b'diavad, truth is you could do it lechatchila. You just have to make sure that marked islay, it's going to have a sign of life. But as long as it survives the shechita, then the halach is hashoichet es hamisukenes is not only something that's b'diavad, it's something that's lechatchila as well. That was the Mishnah. The first part of the sugya discussed how is it that we know that a shoichet es hamisukenes is something that's okay. Now the Gemara's immediate reaction to this whole discussion was, how do you know that a shoichet es hamisukenes is sharia? Umimai tesaga daiten da asira. So the Gemara said, I'll tell you why. Because the pasuk says, Zoisa chaya asher toichlu, and we learn from there, chaya echol v'she'eno chaya lo yisoichal. Now, l'fia emes, we darshan l'mutei treifa. But the truth is, meichet heisias l'mutei treifa. It should be l'mutei anything that doesn't have the ability to live. A misukenes doesn't have the ability to live. It's a quote-unquote eno chaya, and based on that pasuk, you would have thought it's aser. And if that's the case, how do you know it's mutter? The Gemara, in the course of the daf, made 4 suggestions, 3 of which stood. The first one was that from the fact that the Torah says a treifa is aser, zoisay meres, the mesukenes, that's bechlal masayim mana in the treifa, is really mutter. The second makar was from a pasuk that discusses the chelev of a nevela and the chelev of a treifa. And the third makar was, we learn it from a pasuk in Yecheskel, which, by the way, we know throughout Shas, there are many, many halachas that are learned from psukim in Yecheskel. Ad kedei kach, one of the slangs in the Talmud Bavli is this halacha ad da'asi Yecheskel man agmira. If this is something that's learned from Yecheskel, how do we know it before Yecheskel? The Gemara always says that it was a hilchas gemiri law, was halacha l'moishe misin v'asi Yecheskel v'asmach akra. But either way, chalk this up as another halacha that's learned from the world and from the Navi Yecheskel. Either way, today we are going to continue to discuss this very light, albeit critical topic within the world of Shchitas Chulin. part 2 of the sugya of Ashaychet Es HaMisukenes. Zok the Heilige Gemara, again, 11 lines from the bottom of Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. Heichidami Misukenes. What is the definition of Misukenes? So, loosely translated, a Misukenes is an animal that's at. We saw the end of yesterday's daf. The sheikhtim are screaming, kois, kois, shech, shech. But the Gemara wants to know a more technical definition of a misukenes. Rabbi Rav. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of his great Rabbi Rav, kol shemamid noisav enoi medes. If this animal is so weak that if you would put it on its 4 feet, it would not be able to stand, meaning it would come falling down, that's a sign that it's a misukenes. That's when this halacha applies. Which halacha? It's mutter lechatchila, but only if it's mefarches, only if it shows some sort of life during the course of the shechita. Rab Chanina bar Shlamya mishmei Rav Amar, Rab Chanina bar Shlamya, who was also a Talmud of Rav, so he was Moisef. He said, I heard from the Rebbe Rav, afilu eicheles bekoyos. He's not coming to argue, Rashi says. He's coming to add. And that is that if this animal is mamid and oisav ve'inu emedas, even if it has the koyach to eat little twigs, that's still a sign that it's a misukenes, and the halacha of Ashaycha misukenes would apply. Rami bar Yecheskel Amar, and here too Rashi says, he's not coming to argue, he's coming to be moisef, afilu eicheles koyres, that when Rav said afilu eicheles bekoyres, he didn't mean only bekoyres as opposed to koyres. Even if it has even a bigger appetite, and its teeth apparently are the teeth of a young, fresh ox, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if it's mamid and oisa, ve'ena oimedes, it doesn't matter how gezind his appetite is, and how well his mouth is operating. At the same time, it's going to have halacha of it misukena. Says the Gemara, Besura Masni Hachi. Everything that we just said is the way this halacha was presented in Surah. So again, what did we just say? The Rabbi Yehuda Marav said, Heichidami misukenes, kol shem amid anoisev enoi menes. Rabbi Chanina bar Shlamya said over in the name of Rav, he was moisef even if it eats bekoyos, and Rami bar Yecheskel was moisef even more than that, even if it eats koyos. But in Pumbedisa they had a different version of this, very similar. In fact, it's so similar, you have to do a double take to see what the difference is. Heichidami misukenes, and Pumbedisa they said that, what's a misukenes? Rabbi Yehuda Marav said, kol shem amid and oisa ve'enoi medes. Same definition. Even if it eats bekoyos. Rami bar Yecheskel said, not only if it eats bekoyos, these little twigs, but even if it eats koyros, it eats beans, still it's going to be considered misukenes if it doesn't have the ability to stand on its feet. What's the difference between the way they had it in Surah, the way they had it in Pumbedisa? So in Surah, there were 3 names. Rabbi Yehuda Marav said the taich of misukenes. Rab Chanina bar Shlamya mishmei Rav added afilu eicheles bekoyos, and then Rabbi bar Yecheskel added on top of that, even if it eats koyros. In Pumbedisa, they had a little differently. In Pumbedisa, they said that Rabbi Yehuda Marav gave the definition of misukenes, and he added afilu eicheles bekoyos, and Rabbi bar Yecheskel was the one that added afilu eicheles koyros. Look to Gemara. Ashkechinu Shmuel the Talmidei de Rav. Shmuel met the Talmidim of Rav. We know a lot of the Talmidim of Rav, after Rav passed away, Rav was much older than Shmuel. So after Rav passed away, went to learn in the Beis Medrash of Shmuel. But Ashkechinu Shmuel the Talmidei de Rav. Shmuel meets the Talmidim of Rav, Amalahu, he told him, My Omer Rav in Misukenes. You have a chiddush, something you can tell me that Rav said in the world of Misukenes. Amalei, they told him, Hachi Amar Rav, I'll tell you what Rav said. That as it relates to a Misukenes, where the halacha is that if it showed life and vitality through the course of the shechita, the halacha is it's going to be okay, even lechatchila. What is a definition of life? So Rav gave his definition, Goya. If it makes the sound that an animal makes. So if it's a cow, it moos, or if it's some other animal, it does whatever those animals do on the farm. Or if it goes to the bathroom, ba'azna, or if it wagged its ear, reza pirchus. These are all examples of pirchus, and if it's mefarchus, then the halacha is that it's a sign of life. Amalahu. So when Shmuel heard what the Talmidei of Rav said in the name of Rav, what is the definition of life as it relates to a misukenes? He told him, it's trichalei la'abba la'zuzei oini. So Abba Rashi says was lashon of chashivos that Shmuel would refer to his friend Rav as. Abba is like saying Rav, like saying Rebbe. And Shmuel had a lot of respect for Rav, and that's why he called him Rav. Tosfos says just the opposite. Tosfos says that the Shem HaEtzem of Rav was Abba, and just because Shmuel was a chaver of Rav, so he felt close to him and he called him by his name. He didn't have to refer to him as Rav. But regardless, he said that does Rav need that it should even wag its ear? Meaning that's like a very intense level of chiyus. Meaning, it sounds like, according to Rav, the bar is set very, very high in terms of what the definition of pirchus is. Okay, what does Shmuel hold? Sha'ani yomer, Shmuel said, kol she'enoi dvarim. So we have the Gersa Shehamisa, but if you look at the Shittim Bekubetzes, they change it to Shehamisa. That kol she'enoi dvarim shehamisa isa, anything that an animal doesn't do when it dies, meaning any movement that's not a sign of death, is by process of elimination going to be considered a sign of life. So according to Rav, a sign of life means something proactive, something aggressive. It's goya, it's a tilarei, kishkisha ba'azna, which seems like is the biggest of the three. According to Shmuel, any movement, unless it's a movement that's natural for an animal to do when it dies, then obviously it would be a sign of death, not a sign of life. But as long as it's not that, that would be okay. Says the Gemara, man ninu dvarim shamesa isa. In the world of Shmuel, so what is an example of something shamesa isa? So we know that that is eliminated as being a sign of life, but everything else would be considered a sign of life. Amar Rav Anan said, I heard it from Shmuel. This is what he said. In the event that the hand of the animal was bent, and then it spread its hand out, that would not be considered a sign of life. Pshuta, if however it was outstretched, and then it bent its hand, that's something that the mace doesn't do, and that would be considered a sign of life. So according to Rav, it's goya hatilurei kishkisha ba'azna. According to Shmuel, as long as it's not something that a mesa does, that would be a sign of life. And the Gemara said, what is an example of something that a mesa does? So I know what's not something that a mesa does, so I know what's considered a pirchus, what's a sign of life. So Rav Anan said, Shmuel explained it to me. Fake the Gemara, my kamash Shmuel. It sounds a little bit like, Shmuel had to explain what's a sign of life, what's not a sign of life. Right, Rav Anan says, I heard it directly from Shmuel. Isn't it a Mefurish Mishnah? Meaning, it's a Mefurish Mishnah, what's considered a dover shamesa oisa. Tanina, the Mishnah said behema dakish pashti yadav le'yechzira, a behema dak that was pashti yadav le'yechzira, psula da lachas it's possible she'ena elo itzas nefesh, because that's a sign of death. That's something that the animal naturally does as it dies. It's not a sign of life. And what do you see from here? Ha chzira ksheira, that it's only if it's pashti yada. But let's say fakert, let's say the animal's hand was stretched out and then it brought it back in. It sounds like that would be kosher. Meaning the Mishnah told me what is not considered a sign of life. One thing and one thing only, which is exactly what Shmuel said. So Amar Rav Anan, Shmuel explained it to me. Why are we even having this conversation? All I need Shmuel to say is that as long as it's not a davar shamesa oisa, I know that it's considered a sign of life. What that is, and really the Mishnah said both things that Shmuel said. Shmuel said that if it stretches its hand out, it's a sign of death. If it brings its hand in, it's not a sign of death. Both things are in the Mishnah. Stretches its hand out is explicit in the Mishnah. Bringing its hand back in is implicit in the Mishnah. But both of those things are technically in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, almost true. Even Masnisan had, all I had was the Mishnah. Havamina, I would have thought, Dafka, the Kaifa, Upashta, Vader Kaifalo. The only time it's considered a sign of life is if the hand was bent, he stretched his hand out, and then he brought it back in. So you were a moilach and a mevi, right? You went a full circle, you did a round trip, that's when it's considered a sign of life. But let's say the hand was stretched and he brought it back in, maybe not. Now the Mishnah only said if the hand was bent and then he stretched it out, it's not a sign of life. But you'd be able to think that what's the difference if you do it this way, you do it that way. When the Mishnah said that if you stretch it out, it's not a sign of life, it's lafuki because you only went one way. And you have to do a round trip. It's the one-way trip that bothers me. There could have been makom to say that Kamash Shmuel, that's Rav Anan said. The Mishnah. He explained it to me a little bit better. Meaning, I know the Mishnah addresses it, but the Mishnah is a little bit sussum. And I needed the Amir Shmuel to explain it to me, and essentially he was explaining his own position, but the bottom line is, we have here Machlokes Rav and Shmuel, what the definition of life is as it relates to Ashleiches and Mesukenes. According to Rav, it's way more than it is according to Shmuel. According to Rav, it's Goya, it's a Tilarei, it's Kishkisha Ba'azna. According to Shmuel, any movement, as long as it's not what? As long as it's not something that a Mesa is Oisa, and what does the Mesa do? We have it in the Mishnah, and we have Shina Kasav La'akiv, Shmuel himself told it to Rav Anan, and that is, as long as it's not a situation where the animal took its hand and just jerked it outwards at the time of the Shechita, anything other than that would qualify as a sign of life, and you'd be allowed to eat this animal. Freit the Gemara Akasha. It's a Kasha on Rav. Mesaveh. Rabbi Yossi says, Oimer Hayrameir, like Zogin, Goya B'Shashchita Ein Zeh Pirchos. If the animal made its sounds at the time of the Shchita, it's not considered a Pirchos. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yosi Oimer Mishmoi. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yosi said in his name. So whose name is this? Is it Rabbi Yosi's name or Rabbi Meir's name? So Rashi knew we weren't going to be sure, and that's why Rashi says Mishmoi Shel Rabbi Yosi. But either way, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yosi said in the name of Rabbi Yosi, Afilu Hitilo Rei, even if it was Matul Rei, the Kishkish of his Nava, or it wagged its tail, Ein Zeh Pirchos. It's not considered a Pirchos. What's the Kasha? Two kashas. Kasha Goya, Goya Kasha Reya Rei. Rav said Goya is a sign of life. It's Mefurish, Rabbi Yosi Oimer, Hoya, Rab Meir Oimer, Goya B'Shashchita Ein Zeh Pirchos. And Rav said that if it's Matul Rei, it's a sign of life. And Rabbi Yosi said in the name of Rabbi Yosi that Afilu Hitilu Rei is not considered a sign of life. So you have a stira Goya Goya, you have a stira Reya Rei. So the Gemara says they're both not right. Goya Goya like Kasha, why not? Hada Avikolo, Hada Amikolo. Not all sounds that the animal makes are the same. So if it has a thick voice when it makes his moo sound, so then it's going to be considered a sign of life. If it's Amikolo, if it has a shvacha voice at that point, and it won't be. Reya Rei. Nami lo kasha, kam b'shaiseses, kam b'matrezes. Shaiseses means where it was matul rei, but it was very close to where it was. Matrezes means where it shoots out lemei rachik. That is considered already a much more of a sign of life. And if it's matrezes, that's what Rav was referring to when he said, Hitila Rei, Harei Zeh Pirchos. So this really concludes the first part of the daf. Before we go weiter, so we have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. What's the definition of life as it relates to Hashaychtas and Mesokenes? Right? If it shows life during the Shechita, that means it survived the Shechita killed it, it's good. If not, not. Heichidami, what is an example of life? Machlokes Rav and Shmuel, right? Throughout Shas, you have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Here too, you have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says Goya ve'hitila rei ve'kishkisha ba'azna. Now we clarified it a little bit. Goya means avikala. Hitila rei means matrezes. But kishkisha ba'azna, these things hareze perchus. According to Shmuel, no, anything that it does, as long as it's not the one thing that we know an animal naturally and instinctively does as it's dying, anything else is going to be a sign of life. Tosfos, it's the top Tos on the Yomid. He doesn't ask it as a kasha, and he doesn't explain it with a teretz, but he addresses the obvious question. We had a Mishnah. In the Mishnah, there were 3 pshatim amongst the Tanaim, what the definition of life is. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, or Rabbi Gamliel, pick your girsa, said that it's achet tefarches biyadu b'regel. Rabbi Eliezer, we saw also the sheet of Rabbi Shimon said dayim zinka, and then finally we had the sheet of the Chachamim that said if it's mefarches the yad, or the regel, or it wags his tail. So we have 3 shitas hatanam. Why are Rav and Shmuel arguing in a shaila that Tanam already debated? Right? Just let's pick an example. We know there's a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. If that was the machlokes Rabbi Kiva Rab Tarfon, it wouldn't make sense. It should be a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Here's another one. You have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. If Achashverosh was a melech chachamay or a melech tippashaya, right? So if that was already a machlokes Tanoim, so you wouldn't have a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are not supposed to argue with what's mefurish somewhere in a Mishnah or in a Braisa. This is a mefurish Mishnah. Why are they arguing? So Tosfos says that it's muchach that they weren't being mechadish the machlokes, and really the machlokes Rav and Shmuel is which shita in the Mishnah that we paskin like. And Rav, who was machmer, and Rav said that if it's Goya, V'tila Rei, V'kishkish Shabazna, and even Goya means Avikala, and even V'tila Rei reads Matrezes, he's going like the most chomer of the 3 shitas in the Mishnah. And who's the most chomer of the 3 shitas in the Mishnah? The first shita, the shita Sachachomim, has to be Mefarches Yad and Regel. So Rav is paskening like the first shita, the shita of the Tanakama, whereas Shmuel that said that no, as long as it does anything, that's going to be okay. That's the 3rd sheet of the Mishnah. It's the Shita Sachachamim that says if it moved its yad, or its regel, or its kishkish and beznava, all those things would be fine. The bottom line is, Tosfos ein hachinami. The machlokes Rav and Shmuel is not this new machlokes Rav and Shmuel. It's really a machlokes which one of the shitas of the Mishnah do we paskin like. Either way, on that note, we now turn our attention to the next part of the daf, which is going to take us almost until the very, very end of the daf. So, high level, what's about to happen now is the Gemara is going to discuss. So, as it relates to Mesukenes, if it shows life during the Shechita, it's kasha. If it doesn't show life during the Shechita, it's not going to be kasha. At what point of the Shechita would it have to show life? The beginning of the Shechita? The middle of the Shechita? the end of the shechita, right? I mean, I guess those are the three possibilities. Now, you would think that for sure the best case scenario would be the end, because the whole idea is to make sure it survives the shechita. So if it shows life at the beginning of the shechita, but it didn't show life be'emtza or b'soif shechita, then how do I know it actually survived the shechita? So the best you can get is that if it showed life b'soif shechita, that would be great. Next best would be be'emtza, because you know for sure it survived the tchilas hashita. It's still knocking during the middle. I was going to say kicking, but that's a bad pun. It's still kicking in the middle of the shechita, so that gives you a better chance of it knowing that it's alive at the end of the shechita. And of course, the worst case scenario, or the least you would have, is if it showed life b'tchilas hashita. The bottom line is it b'tchila, be'emtza, or b'soif? Spoiler alert, it's three shitas amongst them are wrong. Rav Chizda holds, as we'll see, be'emtza. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak holds b'soif. Rava holds b'tchila. How they all come about in their respective shitas, so that's something that we're going to see now as we go through the Gemara. Amar Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda said, Pirchas sha'amru b'soif shchita. As it relates to Pirchas, that the Tanam said a behema misukenes that's mefarches is going to be fine, it means it was mefarches b'soif shchita. Now, what does this mean? Pirchas sha'amru. So Rashi says, Rav Chizda said, Ani shamati b'soif shchita. The sha'amru is, I actually heard a shmua that it's probably in soif shchita, stating that my b'soif shchita. Rav Chizda said, you know what this shmua meant when they said that the pirchas has to be b'soif shchita? It's be'emtza shchita. It means be'emtza shchita. So why you say b'soif shchita? It's la'fukei tchila shit. So the soif is just la'fukei the tchila, but really it's all about the emtza hashchita. Meaning you could have thought that you need that tchila shchita is enough. Kamash malan soif, but not that it has to be mamish by the spitz soif. As long as it's be'emtza, then already you know that it's surviving the shechita, and there's no reason to assume that it's going to end up dying at the very, very end. How do I know this? Meaning, how do I know that this shmua, that Pirchas b'soif shchita doesn't mean b'soif shchita mamish, but it means be'emtza. So meaning not soif, but not chila, but be'emtza. Said the Tanan, I know from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said behemoth shapash yad v'leiach zira psul. Right, the Mishnah gave an example of where if the animal was mefarches, it's not a sign of life. What was it? A behemoth that was pashed yad v'leiach zira. We just spoke a lot about that. And said Rav Chizda, when exactly did this happen? If it happened at the end of the shchita, kol heichi teichi v'tezel. What has to live so long? Meaning, if it happened b'soif shchita, essentially what you're telling me is that if this animal is still able to make this kind of movement b'soif shchita mamish, and Rashi adds that if it happens b'soif shchita, it's going to probably continue even after the shchita, because the soif shchita is like a nanosecond. So it's going to happen even after at the end of the shechita. So you're telling me that if it has that much life at the very end of the shechita, it's not a sign of life, it's a sign of death? Sign of death would mean if it happened like before the Gemara of the shechita. But even the Mishnah that says there's this jerk that the animal does at the end of its life, that's a sign of death. But it can't be that it's doing it big Gemara shechita, or maybe better even after the shechita already concluded. It's not possible. Obviously it did it by emtza shechita. So what do you see from the Mishnah? That really a pirchas be'emtza shchita is enough. Just this pirchas is not enough. But it's mefurish in the Mishnah, like Rav Chizda, that a pirchas be'emtza shchita is fine. I shamati soif shchita must be la'fukei tchila shchita. But you want to know how I know emtza shchita? That's how I know. Rava told Rav Chizda, I disagree with you. Lo yom soif shchita. Could be soif shchita means soif shchita, which means soif shchita. What's your kasha? If it's soif shchita, that means the pirchas that's not good b'soif shchita is even not good b'soif shchita, as in the gemar shchita, maybe even a second after the shechita. How's that possible? What was the kasha called? Heichi teichi v'tezel? So Rava, yes. Sha'ani yoymer kol she'ena oisa came b'soif shechita. Any animal that doesn't do this b'soif shechita, be a dush and a shmas and a tulam and a kaidem l'kein. It must be that it died earlier. No, there was some balabatish machlekes going on over here, but the bottom line is, Rav Chizda felt that there's no way that if an animal jerks in any way, shape, or form at the gemara of the shechita, that it would be anything other than a sign of life. Which means then that when the Mishnah says that a behemoth daka that's pashta yada is not a sign of life, must be talking about it was be'emtza. Which means that the sugi of pirchas is playing itself out be'emtza. Rava says, I categorically disagree with your premise. I think that, no, there is an idea that b'gmar shchita, an animal will sometimes jerk, and it could be that movement will even go beyond after the shechita was already completed, and it's still considered a sign of death, which means then that there's no hechrach, that the sugya pirchas is playing itself out. It could be it's very much playing itself out b'soif. Either way, that's the first shita, pretty straightforward. It's shitas Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda holds that Shamati, I heard there's an inyan of soif shchita, but he clarified what does soif shchita mean. It means lafuke tchila shchita, but really, it's be'emtza hashchita. So again, it doesn't have to be b'soif shchita. Tchila shchita would be too early in the game, because just because it was alive at the tchila shchita doesn't mean it survived the emtza and the soif. But as long as it's be'emtza, that's that happy medium, and over there it's going to be okay. Rab Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, Pirchos Shamru b'tchila shchita. He said that when it says Pirchos, it means betchila shchita. He didn't hear this shmua that it's soif shmita. He's koifra koil on that. He said that you want to know what pirchas is tchila shchita. Rav Nachman Yitzchak explained. No, I mean, how do I know that it's tchila shchita? And he brought a geschmack raya. The time we learned in our Mishnah, Rav Shimon said, if someone checks in the morning, and he woke up and he saw that the walls were filled with blood, ksheirut halach is the animal's going to be kosher. Meaning you shechted him as at night, and you don't know whether it showed signs of life simply because you couldn't see. It was Laila. So if you wake up in the morning and you see the walls are filled with blood, it's kosher. Shezinka, because it means that it coughed up blood. Ukimidas Rebbe Eliezer, Shitas Rebbe Eliezer in the Mishnah, who said that zinka is a sign of pirchus, that's a sign of life. Shmuel explained that what does the Mishnah mean when it says ulamacha matzak solam leim dam? It means kaisle beis hashchita. It doesn't mean the walls of the barn. It means the kaisle beis hashchita. Okay, now if you're going to tell me b'tchila shchita, if you're going to tell me that tchila shchita is enough shaper, then I understand the halacha of the Mishnah. But if you're going to tell me it's soif shchita, and by the way, whether soif shchita means soif shchita mamish, or like Rav Chizda explained, it means be'emsa shchita, leichush dilma b'tchila shchita zinka. How do you know when you wake up and you see that beis hashchita maleim dam? How do you know that the zinka took place be'emsa shchita? How do you know it took place be'soif shchita? Maybe it took place b'tchila shchita. Elamai, we don't care when it took place. So you see mefurish that even if it happened b'tchila shchita, that in and of itself is going to be okay. Rashi, it's a longish Rashi, says that why did the Gemara throw in the middle that when it says in the Mishnah l'macha matzak salam aleim dam amashmul kaisle be'shchitin? Like, why was that important to the narrative? Let's say the kaislim mean the walls of the barn, the shlachtois. Would anything change? So Rashi says, yeah. Because Rashi says that if an animal coughs up blood outside, you would actually be able to tell. Again, we're not farmers or shaykhim. So if an animal would cough up blood and you would walk in, you see like a murder scene, there's this big mess on the ground, you'd actually be able to tell whether this zinka took place betchila ba'emtza b'sayf. There would be a way to know. If it's in the beis hashchita, there's no way to know. And that's why the Gemara had to throw in va'amar shmuel koisle beis hashchita shaninu, because it's actually ma'akiv in the Gemara's raya. Without Shmuel's memory, there's no Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. But either way, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, I have a mefurish raya from the Mishnah. Because you see in the Mishnah that Reb Shimon said that hashoichet balayla ulamacha matzak salam leim dam ksheira shezinka ukeshitas Rebbe Eliezer that daya in zinka, and there's no way for you to know the dam which is on the ksolim. If ksolim means koisle beis hashchita, the way Shmuel explained it, there would be no way in the world to know if it happened betchila b'emtza b'sayf. Vice, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter when it happened. Even if it was betchila, that in of itself is going to be okay. Must be pirchas works. I feel betchila shchita. But the Gemara has a kasha. V'dilma shani zinuk the adif. Maybe there's a chilik between the sign of life that is zinuk versus the signs of life that come from just the animal throwing its hand or his feet and making different movements and jerks. Maybe there's a certain preferential treatment that zinuk gets because maybe that's a greater sign of life. In other words, it could be that as it relates to just being mefarchis, the yad, the regel, etc., if it happened b'tchila, that wouldn't be a raya necessarily that it survived. But if it had so much koyach that it was able to be a zinuk, well, that's a raya that for sure it's able to survive. So it could be ordinarily a siman of chiyas b'tchila is not a giluy on be'emtza b'soif, but maybe zinuk is better. But the Gemara says you can't say that because umi adif is zinuk better, and this is geshmak. We're going to learn up the Mishnah now. But the Mishnah said as follows. Again, remember the Mishnah, there were three shitas. The first shita was Rav Shimon Gamliel or Rabbi Gamliel that said, Asher tefarches yad beregel. Rebbe Eliezer comes second, and he says Daya and Zimka. What do you see from Daya and Zimka? I mean, you have to be Mefarches Yad V'Regel, you have to do less. Even if you're Zinka. What do you see from that Zinka is less than Yad V'Regel? But the Gemara says, I don't know if that's such a taina, because I could always say Kal Mid Rabba Gamliel. Here you see the Ger says Rabba Gamliel, not like in the Mishnah, it's Rosh Gamliel. V'Adaf Mid Rabbanon. But maybe it's more than the Rabbanon. So meaning, Enochinami, Klapi, the sheet of the Tanakama, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and Achinami. It's Dayan Zinka. But at the same time, it could be Zinka is better than the third sheet. What was the third sheet? Atshet Farches Yad Oiregel. So if you're going to compare and contrast those two, and Achinami Zinka Betchila Shchita would be enough. But it's not a Raya Al Koponim Al Libid. It'd be a Raya according to Rabbi Gamliel, but it won't be a Raya Al Libid Chachamim that if it was Mefarches Yad Oiregel Betchila Shchita, that would be okay. But the Gemara said, Amar Ravina said, Amali Sama Bar Chilkoi. Samir Bar Chilkoi told that Akshiba Avua the Bar Abuvram, that Avua, the father of Bar Abuvram, who Rashi says was Abuvram, asked, some say Achu the Bar Abuvram, it wasn't the father of Bar Abuvram, who was Abuvram, but it was the brother of Bar Abuvram, that with Rabbanim Yadav. Could you suggest that Rabbi Eliezer's Shita is a more Chamadig Shita in the Rabbanim? Can't be. Why? Because for time we learned in the Mishnah, the Chacham with the third Shita. What did they say? Ashet Tefarches, Oy Biyad, Oy Beregel. Right, that's the third Shita. Other Yad, Other Regel. Rabbanim Haikani. Who are the Rabbanim referring to? Ilay Mad Rabbi Gamliel. Are they going back to Rabbi Gamliel? And that's what it sounds like a little bit, right? Rabbi Gamliel or Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, Tefarches Yad Beregel. And the Rabbanim come along and they say, Oy Yad, Oy Regel. But if that's the case, Kivan Shepirchas Amiboyle. The Lashon Adshet Tefarches, Oy Biyad, Oy Beregel sounds like you got to do more. No, it's not enough add until you go a little. What do you mean? It's less. What he should have said was a Lashon that connotes less. For example, Kivan, right? That would be a Lashon that would mean less. Adshet Tefarches means I got to do more. Kivan Shepirchas means that I don't have to do so much, right? Yad V'Regel. Whichever one you did first, other the yad, other the regel, that's going to be okay. Ella pshita, right? We always say this. There's an ella and then there's an ella pshita. Ella pshita is pasha, just from the grammar ad Rabbi Eliezer, that he's commenting on Rabbi Eliezer, which makes sense. The first shita was Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Gamliel. Second shita is Rabbi Eliezer. The chachamim ma'imrim to Rabbi Eliezer. Now, if it's more. Or meaning, if Rabbi Eliezer is more than the Chachamim, then again, it doesn't make sense, the Lashon of Ad. Again, it should have said a Lashon of Kivan, not a Lashon of Ad. So it's Pashit. It's Pashit, that the Chachamim can't be talking to the first sheet, the sheet of Rabbi Gamliel / Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. It has to be that they're talking to Rabbi Eliezer. And if they're talking to Rabbi Eliezer and use the Lashon of Ad, must be Rabbi Eliezer is the less stringent position. Bottom line, if that's the case, you see that Rabbi Eliezer is less than Rabbi Gamliel. Daya im Zinka, he said it, Bokhtzeiner. You see that Rabbi Eliezer is less than the Chachamim, not from what Rabbi Eliezer said, but from what the Chachamim said. They said Ad. So Rabbi Eliezer is the least of the Shittas. Zok Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. If Rabbi Eliezer says Zinka is enough, and in Rabbi Eliezer you see it's enough if it's Petchila Shchita. How do I know that? From Rab Shimon, who was going B'Shitas, Rabbi Eliezer said that if you find the walls of the base of Shchita with them, that's a sign of life, even though I don't know if it happened in the beginning, the middle, the end, because frankly I don't care. Well, if that's the case, and it's true Bezinko, which is the least of all, then it's certainly going to be true for everything else. This is the sheet of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that holds, not like this Shmur that Rav Chizda heard, Soif Shemitah, and he was clearing, we've called it Shita, Shemitah, and Shchita, of course of this stuff. Here's the disclaimer, it's always Shchita. But either way, so it's not like this Shmur that, figure out what else we could call it. It's not like this Shita, or this Shmur, or Shchita, or Shemitah. I'm lost now. It's not like what Rav Chizda had heard, and that is that it's Soif Shchita, and we're trying to figure out if it's Be'emtza or really B'Soif. But rather what it is Betchila. Regardless, we've done 2 of the 3 Shitas, and now we're up to the 3rd Shita about Shchita. Rava says, Pirchas Amru, that when Chazal said Pirchas, it's B'Soif Shchita. He heard the same thing Rav Chizda heard, right? He heard it's Soif Shchita. But he didn't say that Soif means really Emtza, and the only reason we're calling it Soif is Lafuke Techila. But rather, the reason we're calling it Soif, because we mean what we say and we say what we mean. Soif means literally Soif. If we meant Emtza, we would have said Emtza. That is Rava Shita. Rava said, I mean Allah. How do I know this? Now it's interesting. Rav Chizda proved his Shita from the Mishnah. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak proved his shita from the Mishnah. Rava is not going to prove his shita from the Mishnah. In fact, it's going to be a wild zushtel. This is very much mimerchak tavi lachma. So it says Rava. How do I know this? The Tanya I know from the following price. It says in the Torah, Shoir, oy kesef, oy eis, ki yivalid. Oy shivas yomim tachazim, oy umiyem hashmini v'holi yeratz l'karpet yishal Hashem. It's a very important pasuk. This pasuk tells us the halacha that you're not allowed to shecht an animal until it's 8 days old. We know the Chazal, it's a Medrash Rabbin, Parshas Emor, that says that we compare a carbon to a person. And just like a person, a boy, bris milah happens by Yom Hashmini, so too it's by Yom Hashmini v'hala yeratze, as it relates to an animal as well. And this is the makar to this famous raid. The Goyim brings this in his Bir Agra and Hilchas Milah, that when a person is machnis, a son, lebrisa shel Avram Avinu be'itayu bezmane, even shel be'itayu bezmane, he's bringing a carbon. He's not just doing a mitzvah. From this comparison that Chazal made in the Din Yom Hashmini as it relates to Bris Milah versus Yom Hashmini, that a child has to be 8 years old. So this is the pshutei shalmikra of this pasuk, stating that Chazal darshan this pasuk and learned out a lot of other halachas. It says shoir oy kesef. Rashi says the word oy is extra. Didn't have to say oy kesef. We learn from here prat l'kalayim. So in the event you would have this mixed breed of animals, it wouldn't be kosher to be brought as a carbon. It says oy eis. Again, the word oy is extra, and we learn from there prat l'nidma. So what's a nidma? So by the way, this is sugyas that's going to be coming up towards the latter part of the masechta. But a nidma is where a sheep and a goat gave birth to a child. The child is technically a goat, but it looks like a sheep. The bottom line is, it's not something you can bring as a carbon. Ki yivaled, when it says ki yivaled, we learn from the Pratli Yitzadaifen that the only time an animal's kosher should be brought as a carbon is if the birth was a natural birth. If, however, it was a C-section, right, it wasn't born naturally, Yitzadaifen, it's not going to be kosher. It says, Vaiter v'hoya shivas yomim, we learn from there Pratli Mechus Hazman, has to be 7 days old. That's pretty straightforward. And Tachas Imoy, Pratli Yosim, that if the animal is a Yosim, it can't be brought as a carbon. Says the Gemara. Rav is going to work. What does the Braisa mean when it says that a yasim can't be brought as a carbon? Does it mean when we say yasim? How do we define yasim? It means that there was a mother animal, gave birth to a child, and then at some point it died. So right now this child doesn't have a mother, which is the definition of a yas. But says the Gemara, right? We had the same nusach on Amaral. What, this animal, the mother has to live forever? It's a funny halacha that if the animal doesn't have a mother, it's a yasim, and you can't bring it as a carbon. It doesn't make sense. Ella the mesav. Maybe what it means is not that at some point, a year later, the mother died. But it means the mother died before the child, before this animal was born. Well, if that's the case, says the Gemara, if the mother died while the baby was in its womb, that means the mother lost the ability to deliver the child naturally. Which means that the child is going to be a yotze doifen, which means it's already nismaid from ki yivoled. I don't need tachasimai to teach me that. Ela zok the Gemara. Pshita, right? This is not just an L. Ela pshita, right? Those two possibilities are not possibilities. The first one is just because it's untenable, and the second one is because it's already taken. I already have a drasha for this. Ela pshita, what must have happened is that pirish l'misa, is that pirish l'chaim? It must be mamish at the gemar of the later, right as the baby animal was being born, zeh pirish lamisa, the mother, v'zeh pirish l'chaim, the child. Says Rav, if what the pasuk essentially is telling me when it says tachasimai, prat liyasim is that the mother has to be alive, mamish at the end of the leda. So I get this drasha. Meaning, it wasn't ismayed from ki yivaled, because the animal, the mother was alive long enough to deliver naturally, but at the second, mamish gitay v'yadei banka achas zepirish l'chaim zepirish l'misa. Eli amr loy bin chiyusa b'sayf leida. But if you're going to tell me that you don't need that the mother should be alive at the sayf leida, and if it would die a little bit earlier, right? That's what this halacha is coming to teach me. Well, if that's the case, then why do I need the drasha? Nafka. I know this is a little bit of a wordy Gemara, which is why it's a little bit hard to read in real time. We're sort of repeating ourselves. But basically, what Rav is saying is that it's clear that this drasha of Tachasima is coming to say that the mother has to be alive all the way to the end through the Gemara of the Shchita. But if it dies mamish at the Gemara Shchita, then it's not going to be okay. Why? Because if it's coming to tell me anything other than that if the mother died before that, that's when it's going to be a problem. But really, it doesn't have to be alive till the very, very end of the Shechita. Well, that was already Nismaid from Kiyivale. So must be, what we're coming to say is that there's halacha of Tachasimai. And Tachasimai teaches me that if it's Zeh Pirish L'chaim, Zeh Pirish L'misa, it's going to be a psul, because it's not Tachasimai, meaning it has to be alive a little bit more than that. Good. This is a brisa. So again, you have a brisa that learned that a whole bunch of halachas from the pasuk Shor, Oy Kesef, Oy Eis, Ki Yivolet, Vayeshivas Yam and Tachazimai. What we need is Tachazimai. Teaches me Prat Liyasim, Heichidami Yasim. It's talking about, we're at the Gemara of the Shchita, Zeh Pirish L'chaim, Zeh Pirish L'misa. What do you need? You need that it should be alive, the mother, a little bit more than that. Once it's alive a little bit more than that, as long as it wasn't Zeh Pirish L'misa, Zeh Pirish L'chaim, you don't need that it should be alive forever. Right? L'oilam Teichi V'Tezel is not a requirement. But at the very least, it has to be up to that. And Rava backed into how I know that's what the drush is. That's the wordiness over here. Okay, so what does this have to do with our sugya? We're learning a sugya of a sheichet mesukenes where it's mefarches, and we're trying to figure out when the prichas has to be. Rav Shita is soif shchita. I know from this brisa. So if you take a look at Rashi, Zeh Pirish Lamisa. So Rashi says as follows: Vashmi inon kra. So essentially, what's this pasuk of Tachasim by teaching me? The beinon chiyus ad gemar leida. That the mother has to be alive until the gemar leida. Ula achar leida mat. And it even has to be alive a little bit after the Leda. Because if it's Zeh Pirish L'chaim, Zeh Pirish L'misa, that's exactly what we're mamayit from Tachazimai. The Eloi, and if not, Havalei Yasim. It's going to be a Yasim, right? The Al Korche Hai Tachazimai, Lemute Chaya Be'emtza Leda, Umesa B'gmar Leda, Asi, right? That's obviously what it's coming to your mind. Okay, so what does it have to do with us? So if you skip to Rashi, Lomali Kra, Michi Yivali Nafka, Zak Rashi, that you see from here, Shma Mina, that Kol Milsa de Bo Barabonon Chiyusa, Be'inon Sheyeheba Chiyus B'gmar Dilei. You see from here that any time Chazal say you have to have Chiyus, you would have to have the Chiyus when? Mamish, all the way at the very, very end. The Chiyus that the mother has to have, it has to have all the way to the end. So when we say that the Hema Misukenes has to have Chiyas, otherwise it's going to be a problem, it means it has to have Chiyas all the way till the end. So again, what's the Tushtel? That whenever Chazal said you need Chiyas, it means Chiyas ad asaf, ad agmar. You see it from this halacha, because otherwise the animal is going to be considered a Yasan, and if you see it over there, you're going to see it as it relates to a Behema Misukenes as well. So what's the Sikum, what's the recap to this second part of the daf? The halach is that a sheichet mesukenes, if it shows light during the course of the shechita, it's going to be okay. The question is, at what point of the shechita does it have to show light? It's a three-man machlekes. Rav Chizda said be'emtza shechita, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said betchila shechita, and Rava said besoif shechita. And they all had a raya. Rav Chizda's raya that it's be'emtza shechita was really based on a shmur that he heard. Right? He heard a shmur, soif shechita, but he knew soif shechita couldn't mean soif shechita mamish. It can't mean tchila shechita, because that's for sure not soif shechita. So he knew that it has to be be'emtza shechita. Why? Because you see that an animal that jerks itself in a way that a mesa will sometimes do is not considered a sign of life. And Rav Chizda's mind, if that would happen b'soif shechita, for sure would be a sign of life. Elamai, the sugya pirchas is not talking about soif shechita mamish, it's all about be'emtza shechita. So you see clearly, pirchas be'emtza shechita is going to be fine. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said pirchas betchila shechita is okay. What was his raya? His raya was for Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon said if someone sheichet balayla and he finds that the walls of the Beis HaShchita, Maleim Dam, that's a sign that there was zinka. Zinka is a sign of life. Kemidus Rabbi Eliezer, and that will be okay. You have no way of knowing if it happened b'tchila b'emtza b'soif. Faisal, you don't care. And don't tell me zinka maybe is more, because zinka is actually less. We went through the Mishnah, we heard it on it. You see that from the three shitas in the Mishnah, there's no question in the world. The most chamerdige shita is the shita of Rabbi Gamliel, or Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Second is the Chachamim, and third is Rabbi Eliezer. So for Rabbi Eliezer, Tchila Shita is enough. Certainly it's going to be okay for the other Shitas. And then finally, Rava said that Soif Shchita and Soif Shchita Mamish. What's my raya? My raya is, because you see, whenever we talk about Chias always means the Gemar. I know it from the Gemar of the Leda of a Yasim in the world of Karbonos, and the same is going to be true here. What does Rava do with Rav Chizda's raya. Rav Chizda had a raya that seif doesn't mean seif, it means be'emtza. So if you remember, Rava addressed it already. Rava was the one who was doicher Rav Chizda's raya. Amar Rava la'olam b'seif shchita. Sha'ani yomer kol she'ena oisa came b'seif shchita b'yadua she'nishmas and netule meru kaidum l'chein. When we learned Gemara in real time, we didn't realize that Rava was really setting himself up to be able to go ahead and say another pshat. So the reason Rava didn't hear of Rav Chizda's raya, he already addressed that he was the Baal Plukta, he was the one that was Makrish Raya that he brought. What about Rav Shimon's Raya? Doesn't Rav Shimon have like a really good Raya? Or Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's Raya from Rav Shimon? You see Zinka, and Zinka you have no way of knowing if it's B'tchil B'emtzo B'soif. That seems to be a good Raya. And this is something that the whole Shmua has to be Miyashav. Rav Chizda's Pshat in the Shmua, Rav's Pshat in the Shmua, heading Miyashav that. So Tosfos speaks it out, and Tosfos says that it was Loi Shchiach for the Zinuk to happen, but Chila was always Shchiach for it to happen in the Saif. So even though it's true, beyond a reasonable doubt, you have no way to know, but the Mitzvah says that usually the Zimka took place B'Saif. And being that usually the Zimka took place B'Saif, so it's fair to assume that that's what happened over here as well. Either way, moving along to the third part of the daf. Amar Rava, Rava said, Hilchis aki hamasnisa. As it relates to the halachis of all these dinin, it follows the following brisa. The brisa says, Behim madaka shapashti yada, v'loi hichzira psula. That a behim madaka that was pashti yada, v'loi hichzira psula. So again, a behemoth daka as opposed to a behemoth gasa. It was pashtiya that stretched his hand out. It was loyach sira psula. We knew this already from the Mishnah because that's a sign of death, not a sign of life. But medvar mamurim stating that says the brayse biyat. That's only true if it was pashta the yat. Aval beregel if it was the foot. Bein pashta v'loy kafafa bein kafafa v'loy pashta. It doesn't matter if it's stretched out or it stretched it back. In either situation, ksher it's going to be kosher. But medvar mamurim zak the brayse bedaka. It's only true if it's a behemoth daka. Aval begasa if it's a behemoth gasa. Then bein biyad bein beregel, right? Behemoth daka matters if it's the yad of the regel. But over here, bein biyad bein beregel, bein pashta v'loy kava bein kava v'loy pashta. Ksher in all situations it's going to be kosher. And as it relates to a bird, afilu loy rifreif elagapoy. Rashi says rifraf is less than kishkush. So whatever kishkush is, just subtract a little bit and you have a rifraf. But even if it wagged something, it's a wing, v'loy kishkush, right? And it didn't do a kishkush, because rifraf is less than kishkush. I'm sorry, v'loy kishkush is navai, and it was mekashketz in zon of arezeh pirchus, then in itself would be considered a pirchus. So Rava says, you want to know the halachis? I'm going to give you the halachis. The halachis are like this. It comes to behemoth daka, if it's pashta, it's a sign of death. If it brings it back in, that's already a sign of life. That's only true if it's the hand. If it's the foot, pashta, kaffa, it's all in the same. That's all true for behemoth daka. Behemoth gasa, doesn't matter if it's the hand or the foot, and if it went out or in every situation will be fine. And by the way, as it relates to a bird, even it just gives a little tweak or tweet, even that itself is going to be okay. And the Gemara asks, I understand, my kamash malon, what's the grace of chiddush over here of Rava? Tonini, isn't it a Mishnah? Isn't it a Mishnah? The Mishnah said, that was the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah wasn't nearly as wordy as the Brisa. That should not come as news to anybody. But at the same time, really, everything that you have in the Brisa, you can extrapolate from the Mishnah. Why? Because what does the Mishnah say? Oh, yada in regaloi. Sounds like as it relates to the regal, no, the foot is always going to be a sign of life, it's always going to be kosher. Not just that, it's a payment daka in gasaloi. So you see clearly as it relates to gasa, doesn't matter hand or foot, it's always going to be fine. So what's the kasha? It's really mefurish in the Mishnah. So if it's mefurish in the Mishnah, so it's not a kasha on the Brisa, it's a kasha on Rava. Rava said, Hilchasaki hamas naisa. Of course that's the halacha, it's mefurish in Mishnah. Rashi explains, because we know halacha is stam Mishnah. And being that halacha is stam Mishnah, and if this is all a stam Mishnah, so I don't need to know of a Brisa to know what the halacha is. Meaning, it sounds like Rava walked into Beis Medrash, I'm going to tell you halacha, you have to, everyone listen clearly, because it's a very important halacha l'maisa. The halacha is, behema, daka, yad, regel, gasa, agansa maisa. This way, that way. It's so obvious. Everyone knows this. Any person that's a Ben Esel Mishnah is going to know this halacha because he's going to know that the Mishnah said it's a stam Mishnah behema daka in gasaloi shepashta yada in raglaloi. So isn't it all mefurish? And the Mishnah the Gemara says yes. Oif. It's trichalei the loitnan. The one part of this brayso that Rava needed in order to lay down the law of the land was as relates to oif. Didn't say one word about rifrif. We wouldn't remember that. Didn't say the word rifrif in the Mishnah. That was something that is only exclusively in the brayso, and it's for that reason that Rava felt he had to say Hilchasa ki ha mas naisa exhale, and really this is an exhale on the whole sugya of hashoichet as a misukenes. So as it relates to raid, two ha'aras. The first, we're going to go back to the Beis HaLevi and talk a little bit more about it. The second one is Dvar Agada, just to end this series of intense dafin on a little bit of a lighter note. So, over the last several days, we've been discussing the Beis HaLevi in Chelik Beis Siman Yud Aleph, which discusses Shitas Rashi in the sugya of Hechled b'miyat simanim, which is on Daf Lamed Amud Beis, and Shah b'miyat simanim, which is on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph. So the Gemara in two places here in Perek HaShoichet had an ibaya. What happens if somebody messes up Shoichet b'miyat simanim? He tripped up on one of the halachas of Moshe Misinai. And Daf Lamed Amud Beis, the Gemara's question is if he did Chalada b'miyat simanim. And Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, the Gemara's shaila is he did Shehiyah b'miyat simanim. Both cases, Hechla b'miyat simanu mao, Shah b'miyat simanu mao, and the Gemara gives the same answer. In both sugyas, it's a one-word answer, Teku. Tishbi yataris kushas v'yibais. We've mentioned that there's machlokes Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, how to learn Pashut Pshat in the Gemara. Rashi learns that the shaila was, in the event, that the Shoichet already did roiv of the simin bekashros, but he messed up in the miyut basra. Do we say that being that roiv is really all you need, and he already got roiv right, so this is a kosher shchita, and it's for that reason what you do in the miyat basra is neither here nor there? Or do you say, being that you went weiter, so the halach is now you have no choice, but you have to get it right, and if you got it wrong, you're a moisef kereya? Rabbeinu Tam is chaylik with Rashi, and the primary reason is because how could it be that if you already got the shchita right, even though you decided to go weiter, but if you messed up only in the miyat basra would be an issue. And it's because of that Rabbeinu Tam learns that the shaila was hechlid v'shah b'miyat simanim, but not the miyat basra. It was only the miyat kama. Now you ended up getting roiv right, hence the shaila. But the point is, it was not the miyat basra where the mistake occurred, but rather it was the miyat kama where the mistake occurred. We mentioned that as it relates to Shitas Rashi, there's a big machlokes rishonim. What Rashi meant. The Raj ben Teres Habayis, the Marshal and Yam Shel Shloimo, and really Rav Rishonim understood that even Rashi, who learned that there's a sugya in two places, Lamed Beis, Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, Hechel miyat basra, Shah b'miyat basra, and there's a tzad that even though you got it right, maybe now you were moisef gereya, it's only midrabanan. We're guys at the miyat basra, out to the miyat kam. But Midayraisa, it's pashit. Once you get it right, you got it right. There's no way to mess it up. Stating that, the Tfusha brings from Rabbeinu Yeruchim that said that Alibet Rashi, the Gemara's Ibaya is an Ibaya Deiraisa. And it's even matched that way from Rashi. Because Rashi says that being that the Gemara says Teku, the halach is we go l'chumra, and if it's a shayla with the Rabbanon, it would be a Sveika de Rabbanon l'kula. And from the fact that we go l'chumra, it's mashmat, it's a Sveika Deiraisa l'chumra. And if that's the case, really, the shayla then becomes, what's the lumdus of Rashi? What's the tzad? That even though I did roiv of it already, and be'etzim I got it right, but if I was hechel to be a master, shabbat me a bastard, it should be an issue. So the Beis HaLevi says that Pshat and Rashi is that yesh lachkar. When we say that a sheikhet only has to shecht roiv of the simanim, v'rubei kakulai, is the taich of rubei kakulai that the shear of how much of the siman you have to shecht is the roiv, and once you do the roiv, the rest of the siman might as well just be the foot. It's not a mokim, it's not a chelik anymore of where the shchita needs to be chal. Shchita is not chal in roiv of the siman, shchita is chal in the ganze siman. Narvas, because of rubei kakulai, I don't need to shecht the whole siman to have a shchita in the whole siman. If I shecht roiv of the siman, that itself can get me a shchita in the ganze siman. So the Beis HaLevi, Rashi understood that shchita has to be in the whole siman. Narvas rubei kakulai tells me that when I shecht roiv, I get a shchita in the miyut basra as well. If I would not shech the miyut basra, it's true I would have a shchita in the miyut basra, al yudei the shchita of the roiv. But that's pashit. If I decide to go and shech the miyut basra, so the shchita is not because of the make-believe shchita that I got al yudei rubik kuloi. The shchita is there because of what I did. So if it's chal shchita in the miyut basra, well then we understand why if you hechleb in miyut basra, you shab in miyut basra, it's going to be a problem. If the way rubik kuloi works, and specifically Rubai Shalachet Kamayu in the world of Shchitas Chulin is that the Shchita is only Chal in the Roiv. So it's not Chal Shchita in the Miyat Basra. So it doesn't matter how I shecht it, if I shecht it, when I shecht it, why I shecht it. It's like shechting the ear or the foot. It's not part and parcel of the shechita. So there's no way that a hechla b'miyat basra and a shav b'miyat basra would be a problem. Now Rashi learned that the shechita was always chal in the miyat basra. Nervous, it's chal in the miyat basra al yedei the right. But if you decide to go ahead and do the shechita in the miyat basra yourself, then it's being chal al yedei the shechita. That is what Rashi understood, and hence this Gemara Zibaya with a teiku, hanhaga l'chumra. But this is the longest that the Beis Halevi extrapolated from Shitas Rashi. Sayon daf lamed amid beis, sayon daf lamed beis amid alf. Now we were mefalful a little bit, Be'ezus Hashem, in this Shita of Rashi, Bichlal, and the Havana of Shitas Rashi of the Beis Halevi Befra. We spoke about it a little bit from the Kachim perspective, because in Kachim there's a term called Miruk. It comes from a Mishnah in Yuma Daf Lamed Aleph on the Beis, and Miruk is the Hashlama, it's the Gemar the Shchita. And we brought two rayas from Gedolei Achronim that the Miruk of a Shchita in the world of Kachim is not treated like the Shchita. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, where there was a kpeda of him to do all the avodah, he would do the shchita of the Talmud Shal Shachar, but because he had to do the Kabbalah, he had no choice but to have someone else do the miruk, and there was no kpeda on that. The Tosefta in the beginning of Masechtas Zvachim says that if Roiva the shchita would be done without a machshava shalei l'shma, but the miruk would be done with a machshava shalei l'shma, it's neither here nor there. And the shaila is, what's the reason that in shchitas chulin, Hechla b'miyat basra, v'sham b'miyat basra is a teku with a sifkat and shulchan aruch that you're supposed to be machmer. Yet in the world of kachim, miruk ad. I don't care if a zar does it on Yom Kippur. You want to do miruk with a machshav shlosh? I got Rav Vin right already. If you have the lumdus in the Beis Halevi, as a tutzach pashchita in the miyut basra. Narvos usually al yedei the roiv, but now that I went ahead and did it, it's happening through my shchita. So why should it be okay if a non-kohen gadol does it on Yom Kippur? And why should it be that if I had a machshav shlosh l'shma, it shouldn't be a problem? So that was something that we were mafalful about. More recently, we mentioned the Gevaldige Chiddush for Reb Chaim Brisker that Rav Hirsch Pesach brings in his Har Tzvi, that he heard from Reb Yisrael Weltz, a Maisa Shaya Kachaya, in the city of Brisk, where there was a Sheichet that was Shah b'miyat Basra, but Reb Chaim was Mekel because the animal wasn't Mefarches, based on our sugya of a Sheichet Mesukenes, where it's Mavur that if it's Loi Mefarches, it's Becheskes Nevela Ad Kedei Kach, the Rambam says Loikin Aleh. So if that's true L'chumra, it should be true L'kula as well. And Reb Chaim said that being that it wasn't Mefarches, must be that it already died out of Shchitas Rav Simon, and if it died out of Shchitas Rav Simon, that means what you did in the Miyat Basra was nothing. So even though it's true, all the lumdis, you could pile a Shchita in the Miyat Basra, but once it's dead already, then obviously you can't do nothing. And it's for that reason Reb Chaim went ahead with his Koich Datera, and we spoke out Reb Tzvi Pesach's two Aras and some more contemporary Lamdish Aras as it relates to this Gevaldige Chiddush from Reb Chaim. But Lahashlomas Ha'inyan, just to mention one more Ha'ara, and it's really, this is one of these mind teasers, and it's a fascinating shaila that the Gedolei Achronim discuss. And it begins with a Shef Shmaitza. The Shmaitza is in Shmaitza Aleph. It's Perek Chav Beis. So here's the background. We know Sveika Deiraisa L'chumra, Sveika Medeiraisa L'kula, stating that the Halach and Shulchan Aruch is, it's based on Rishonim and Sugis Hashas, that the only time you go L'kula when there's a Sveika Medeiraisa is if it's not going up Keneged a Chazaka. But if there's a Chazaka Keneged a Sveika, then the halacha is, even b'makom sveika, you're still going to go l'chumra. So sveika midayraisa, but only shaloi kineged chazaka. Right? That's in contrast to a one suffix where you go l'chumra, even shaloi kineged chazaka. But if you have a sveika kineged chazaka, the halacha is, you're going to go l'chumra. It's for that reason, the halacha is, that if a sheichet shecht, and he has a sveika, whether the shechita was okay or not okay, we don't eat the meat. And the reason is, based on a Gemara Daf Tes, where the Gemara says, Behema b'chayea b'cheskas iser oimedes, and therefore it's always considered to be be'iser achivad alacha until you know for sure that something happened. Every behema, before it gets a kosher shchita, is considered to be b'cheskas iser. Now what's the cheskas iser? That's machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi learns the cheskas iser is the cheskas evim menachai. Tosfos says, once you shech the animals, for sure not an evim menachai. So you can't say evim menachai. Rashi holds machzakina meyasel iser. This is a whole nother Indian. But Tosfos says, what's the cheskas iser? It's the cheskas ein zavach, because it says in the Torah v'zavachta, which means either a mitzvah saseh tzarambam, a lava bab michala saseh tzarayvet. But the bottom line is that if you don't shecht yet, your violating Ki'ilu the Vizavachta, or you haven't fulfilled yet the Vizavachta, and if you would go ahead and eat it, that would be considered Isser Ein Zavuach, and that's what the Cheskas Isser is. But the bottom line is, every animal until the Shechita is Becheskas Isser, and for that reason it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that if there's a Svek Sveika in a Shechita, you don't eat it. It's a Svek Sveika, but it's Keneged Chazaka. Which Chazaka? Chulin Daf Tesam and Aleph. It's the Cheskas Isser, according to Rashi, Cheskas Evim and Achai, and according to Tosfos, it's the Cheskas Ein Zavuach. Claire's the Shev Shmaitza. What would be if there's a Svek Sveika in the Miyut Basra? What would be if the Shochet shechted the Miyut Basra and he had a Svek Sveika? Lidi Dan, that we're machmer like Shitas Rashi, that a Shechita in the Miyut Basra is considered Shechita, and therefore you better get it right. I feel him a rice. So, l'chumra. What would be right now if you had a Svek Sveika? Says the Shev Shmaitza, I'm very, very not sure. On the one hand, my feeling is it should be no different than if I had a Svek Sveika in the Tchila or the Ensa of the Shechita. If there's a Svek Sveika in the Shechita, even though Svek Sveika, even with the rice, you always go l'kula, but not Keneged Chazaka. Over here there's a Cheskas Isser, so Cheskas Isser is other from a Svek Sveika. Abazok the Shmaitze, I'm not sure. You know why I'm not sure? Because when this Sheichet went ahead and he shechted the Roiv, at that point it became kosher. So at that second, the Cheskas Isser went away. The Evim and Achai, the Cheskas Ein Zavuach, at that point, the Isser went away. If at that point the Isser went away, now that I go weiter with the Miyut Basra, I'm not so sure that Miyut Basra is going head-to-head anymore with a Chazaka. Up until the Roiv, you had the Chazaka. But the minute I did the Roiv, at that point, the Chazaka went away. Because the Isser went away. Right? If you would shech the Roiv, drop your knife and take a bite out of this animal, it's kosher. You didn't do anything wrong. That means there's a moment in time where there's no Cheskas Isser. So if there's a moment in time where there's no Cheskas Isser, so if I go weiter and I have a Svek Sveika, I can't treat it anymore as a Svek Sveika. Can I get this? What's the other side? The other side is that being that there's a lumdus, we know what the lumdus is, the Beis Halevi. But being that there's no lumdus, then when I go weiter, it's considered part of the Shechita. And when I go weiter, these are the words of the Shmaitzer. Igloi milsalem afreya. That the Shechita hat sich nicht abgetan al yedei the Roiv, but now the Shechita is happening al yedei everything. I only have to do Roiv. No, really I have to do everything. I just get everything through the Roiv, but the extent that I go weiter is Shechita, which means the Shechita is not finished yet. So if the Shechita is not finished yet, it's still going up. Keneged Chazaka. So Keneged Chazaka is going to be a problem. Here's the point. Do you look at it in the real time? Or do you look at it based on what's going on in the world of the Mafreya? When I get up to the Miyut Basra and I'm about to do something that's going to involve a Svek Sveika, at that second there's really no Chazaka. It's when I go and I fearois, and now it's a Gloi Milsalam Afreya that I continued along, and that I was mashlim the Shechita al Yedei, the physical Shechita, that Limafreya, in the world of retroactive, that Chazaka went away. So when I was living it in real time, the Chazaka wasn't there. Because the Issa went away. But then again, I went weiter. And the minute I decided to go weiter, so now we're ready, the Gloi Milsalam Afreya, that the Chazaka really never went away. And if that's the case, it's Svek Sveika, Keneged Chazaka. So Claire's the Shmaitza. It's funny, Shmaitza is a hard sefer, right? So you sit down, if you're not holding in Chulin, Lamed Beis, Daf Tes, and the sugyas that we're learning right now, this is an almost impossible Shmaitza. But the truth is, we're holding in it, and this is already the fourth rate by B'siyata Deshmaya on this topic, so we know the Indian a little bit. It's like a Shmaka Shaila. In the event they had a Svek, right? Usually Svek Sveik Miyut Basra, when you're learning Bava Kama, this is hard. But Svek Sveik in the Miyut Basra, where ordinarily a Svek Sveik in the Shechita, being that it's Keneged the Cheskas Isser, would be dead on arrival, but now that it's in the Miyut Basra, and in real time, Be'etzim, the Cheskas Isser went away, so maybe it's a Svek Sveik Shloi Keneged Chazaka Dalach Zikagol Kula. Or do you say, no, Igloi Milsalam Afreya, when I decided to go weiter, that the Shechita was not Nishlam, so now it's Hadadina, that it's Ein Zavuach, it's Evim and Achai, and if that's the case, based on this, that should be a problem. So Zok the K'tzais, V'nira. What do you think the K'tzais is going to say? What's the hergish of the K'tzais? V'nira. The Chol Kahai Gavna, kiven de beschitas ruva hutter, afal gav the hoder kishen noilet basafik miet basra. Vim shab miet basra havle kilo le nishchata kla. Mi kamakim moikila becheskes shahoyo koidem shenesav miet basra, da have becheskes heter, the shavik la acha schitas ruva hutra. Sagt the Ktsois, my hergish is mutter. My hergish is that being that when I shechted the roiv, the cheskes went away, even though I went fighter, and even though hechled me a basra, shaved me a basra, we go l'chumra mit tateku with the base halevi super duper lamdas. But at the end of the day, l'maisna, at that point, the chazaka went away. And if it went away, my hergish is that's the way it's going to be. Then the Ktsois says, "V'raya lozeh." I have a raya, and the Ktsois says raya is from Periko Isha Rabba Mesechtes Yivamis Daf Pei Ches Amud Aleph, which is beyond the scope of this raid bite. But the emes is the Gedolei Achroinim are all mitzayin that there was another Achroin that said what the Ktsois said, albeit benusach achiktsas, and he brings a murder raya from a raya that's not beyond the scope of this raid bite, from a Gemara that we learned together. The Achron is the Chemda Shloima, the Varsha V'Rov. His raya is in Shailas Tshuvas Chemda Shloima Yeridei Siman Zayin. The Chemda Shloima in that Tshuva is discussing Divrei Rashi. The frat with the Shita of Rabbeinu Yerucham as quoted by the Tvur Shar, that Hechel b'mi and Basra, of a Shabbat b'mi and Basra is a Shaila on a Dairaisa level. Says the Chemda Shloima, Hoyol v'ani asuk b'divrei Rashi halas. I want to share with you a suffix that I had. Hoyisi mistapik. When does the Isser Eva Menachai in the world of Rashi's Hechel b'mi and Basra, of a Shabbat b'mi and Basra go away? So we know when Shoichet shechts an animal, the Isser Eva Menachai goes away. Right? For a guy, Eva Menachai is Misa Talia, for a Yid it's Beshchita Talia. So the question is, at what point does the Isser Eva Menachai go away? So ordinarily, you shech the Roiv of the Simonim, when you shech the Roiv of the Simonim, the Isser Eva Menachai goes away. But what would be, says the Chemda Shloima, if the Sheikh decided to go weiter, and he decided to shech even the Miut Basra, do we say that being that he went weiter, Igloi Milsalam Afreya, that the Isser Eva Menachai did not go away when you shechted the Roiv? Or do you say that being that if you shech the Roiv and you drop your guns, at that point, the Isser Eva Menachai is gone, it's not going to come back because you decided to go weiter. And even though there's a sugya of Hechel Miyat Basra, Shabbat Miyat Basra, Beseder, that just means that it's Chal Shchita even in the Miyat Basra. But was negay the Isser Eva Menachai, it went away. So if it went away, well, I'm afraid it's going to come back. This is the suffix that the Chemda Shloima had. Nistapakti, when would the Isser Eva Menachai go? So it's interesting. He says that Lefum Riyata, my hergish was that the Isser Eva Menachai should go away when you finish the shechita. So that even though it's true, if you pause the screen, when you do Roiv of the Simonim, there's no Isser Eva Menachai. And if somebody would take a bite out of this animal right now, he's not over the Isser Chomer of Eva Menachai. But avifel, you decided to go weiter, and you see that's considered a shechita, so you gloi Muslim afrei or not. So he said, as the from Riyata is, that there should not be an Isser Eva Menachai, stating that the Isser Eva Menachai should be there. Because if you decided to go weiter, so the Isser Eva Menachai, Kilu Lemafreya, just jumped right back. Stating that, he says, I have a Mefurish Raya. I have a Mefurish Raya, not that way. And the Raya is from a very Geshmak Gemara, the Gemara that we learned together, and we went back to in one of the earlier raid bites in the Masechta, and that is in Gemara and Daf Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara over there brings that there was a Machlokes Rav Acha and Ravina regarding the sakin of a treifas. You have a sheichet, he shechted an animal, and it turned out that the animal was a treifa. The question is, does the sheichet need to kasher the sakin now, or does he not have to kasher the sakin now? What would be the tzad that he should have to kasher the sakin? It's because we know that the beis hashchita is choyim. It's considered to be hot. And as a result, there's blias and plaitas. To the extent that he shechted a sakin, there's blias of, he shechted a treifa, said there's blias of treifa inside the sakin right now. So he should have to go ahead and do agol. And that's what's going on over there. And the Gemara is different stadim of what the shaila might exactly. Says the Gemara, l'chura, I have a raya that if somebody shechts a treifa, you don't have to kasha the sakin. You know what the raya is? Because if a sheichet has a treifa, the sakin needs agala, then every single time you shecht an animal, the sakin should need agala. And the reason is, because when the sheichet goes in and shechts the animal, before the shchitas roiv simonim, the animal's eva menachai, which means that the sakin has blias of eva menachai. So if it has blias of Eva Menachai, because of the Chayim Beis HaShchita, so you should always have to do agol. So we spoke about this, you have a raya from here that there's something called blias in Eva Menachai. But the bottom line is, so L'chura says the Gemara, it's pashut that a sakin of a treifa you don't have to be magol. Because if you have to be magol, the sakin of a treifa, then every time a sheichet shechts, you have to be magol. No one ever heard of such a thing. But the Gemara says, no, that's not a raya. You know why it's not a raya? because it's true that the Beis HaShchita is chayim. And it's true when you shecht an animal that's not kosher with a sakin, it's going to be baileya from the animal, and there would be a problem. But when does the Beis HaShchita become chayim? When does it become hot enough for it to do what it does in the world of Yeridea? It's at the Gemara the Shchita. At the Gemara the Shchita, it's not even Menachai anymore, because it's only even Menachai before the Gemara the Shchita. And being that at the Gemara the Shchita, it's not even Menachai, so mathematically it just doesn't line up, and for that reason, it's not going to be a problem. No, the Gemara says, Be'etzim, you're right. Every single time you shecht an animal, L'man Amar sakin treif is by Agolo, you should need Agolo on the sakin. But technically it's not an issue, because when it's Evim Menachai, it's not Cham, and when it's Cham, it's not Evim Menachai. So you never have it that it's Cham and Evim Menachai, so like this you're going to have an issue. Zoktechem the Shloima Doven Nifla. He says, that's all good when you shecht only Roif. He says, but what's going to be if the Shochet goes in and he shechts the entire simon, which the Halacha Shulchan Aruch says you're supposed to do? That's the mitzvah lechatchila, right? We saw right in the beginning of Perek HaShoichet, Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, Samafurish Gemara, that lechatchila you're supposed to go ahead and shecht, right? You're supposed to go ahead and do it. In that situation, every time the Shoichet does a lechatchila, you're going to end up with this problem. You know why? Because when you shech the roiv, it's be'etzem shchita. You're going to have the halachas of Chaim Beis HaShchita. How do I know that? Because all the halachas of Chaim Beis HaShchita are totally in a shchita, and shchita beroiv is considered a shchita. So it's pashut you're going to have the Chaim of the Beis HaShchita when all you do is you shech the roiv. And if you're going to tell me that late Rashi's shchita in Hechel Mi'as Shabbat Mi'at Basra, when I go weiter, it's Chayzev and Neir, the Isser Evim and Achai. So when I shech the Miyat Basra, the sakin's being by layer from the Evim and Achai. It's true up until the Roiv, you'll tell me there's no Chamimos. But when I go ahead and I shech Roiv, now it's Heis. It's super duper Heis now. So for sure what happens in the Miyat Basra does have the ability to be by layer. And if it's going to be Vayt Evim and Achai, it should be a problem. Zochtechem the Shloima, if that's the case, it's klar that even though my hergish was that if I go weiter, in the world of Rashi, you have to say the Issa Evim and Achai is going to be there. The Issa Evim and Achai is really not going to be there. Azoi Daf Men Zogen, you have no choice but to say that this is the way it's going to be. If you think about it, the Shev Shmaitza and Shmaitza Aleph Chav Beis and the Chem de Shloim and Yeridei Siman Zayin, they both arrived in the same exact place. They're both saying the same thing. What they're both saying is that even though there's a Shitas Rashi of Hechla b'Miyat Basra and there's a Shitas Rashi of Shah b'Miyat Basra, but this whole Shitas Rashi is only negeya that if you mess up in the shchita is going to be a shchita psula. But at the same time, that's klar that as it relates to the cheskas iser, be it evim and achai, be it cheskas ein zavuach, the cheskas iser is going to go away. In the shmaitz's world, what would be if you had a svek sveik in the miyat basra? By the way, it could be you don't even need a svek sveik in the miyat basra, because if you remember, the whole shaila of the miyat basra is a suffix with a tekel. So it could be even one suffix would be mitzdarf. But either way, a svek sveika in the miyat basra would be not considered a svek sveika b'makim chazaka. It would be considered a regular svek sveika. You would go l'kula, which the Shmait says a chiddush, because in Hilchot Shchita, when there's a svek sveika, we're machmer. But in the miyat basra, as much as we're machmer in the miyat basra, but being that it's shloi keneged chazaka, over there not. Chem Shlomi was discussing: is there an issa evim and achai? That was his discussion. Is there issa evim and achai? And the Chem Shlomi said the same thing. That even if you go weiter, where we look at what you did weiter as being part and parcel of the shchita, but at the same time, that is only as it relates to if what I did is shchita or not shchita. But was is negay the issa evim and achai, that's poshet issa evim and achai is going to go away. They're saying the same thing. They're both saying that even though the shchita goes weiter in the miyat basra, but what's negeya, how I view the animal right when I finish the roiv, they're both saying I view it now as a kosher animal. I view it as a kosher animal. Now, if I mess up, then you're going to l'mafreya have a problem. But l'maisa, I view this as a kosher animal, and therefore, in the world of the Shev Shmaitza, you don't have any of the chaskas isers, and in the world of the Chem de Shloima, you're not going to have an Isser Evim and Achai. What's interesting though is that the Shev Shmaitza in his Muschel Rishon in his Shtikl Torah was v'nira dechol ki I gavna kivin the b'shchitas ruba huter afal gav the hoder כשנוילה בסוף מיפס ומשם מיפס אבל כאילו נשכח גם כמוכם מויקילו בחסקה שהיו קודם שנצב מיפס אף בחסקה סתה the muschorishin of the ktsois of the Shev Shmaitza, the velin nira of the Shev Shmaitza there's no one who's a bigger authority in the world of Chazakas than the Shev Shmaitzer, right? So the Shev Shmaitzer, maybe the Shev Shmaitzer's brother, the Kuntrus Asvekas, but the Shev Shmaitzer, in his Lefum Riyato, the veneer of the Shev Shmaitzer was that this is the way it should be. The Chem de Shloime Gana Ga'oinem. The Chem de Shloime was about Plukta of the Shev Shmaitzer. The Chem de Shloime was at Geretten Lernen mit the Nesivis, Rab Kiveg and the Chasam Sofer. The Chem de Shloime was the Varshaver Rav. The Chem de Shloime, his Lefum Riyato was just the opposite. His Lefum Riyato was the other way around. At the end of the day, they both degreicht in the same exact place. They both arrived, they met up, because at the end of the day, they had rayas. Ironically, the Shmaitzer did not have a raya from the Sugis of Chulin. The Chem de Shloime had a raya in the flaw from the Gemara and Chulin, Daf Ches Samad Beis. But again, it's a fascinating discussion, a little bit of a mind teaser. We'll save the second raid by Metzchem for tomorrow, and we'll stop here.